You can tell when an empath is dying inside, not by what they say, but by how quietly they keep showing up. There's a quiet extinction happening inside the most sensitive souls on this planet. No headlines speak of it. No one grieves it. But the empaths, the deeply feeling ones, are slowly disappearing beneath the weight of their own compassion. It begins invisibly. You keep giving time, energy, love, attention, because you've been told that's what makes you good. You absorb pain as if it were a sacred duty. You soothe others before they even ask. You call it empathy. But it's not empathy anymore. It's survival. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't show on your face, but lives in your bones. It's the ache of always being the safe place, the listener, the healer. Until one day, there's nothing left to give. You wake up feeling heavy in the chest, disconnected from your joy, yet unable to stop giving because somewhere deep inside, you believe your worth depends on how much you can carry. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For the empath, that terror is doubled, because to accept yourself means admitting that your kindness has become a form of self-betrayal. You learned that love means endurance, that peace means silence, that to keep the connection, you must hold your pain behind a gentle smile. So you gave and gave and gave again until your boundaries dissolved and your identity blurred into everyone else's needs. And yet, people kept coming. They poured their darkness into you, not out of malice, but because they felt safe. You became the emotional landfill of everyone's unspoken wounds. And what did you do? You smiled, said, "I'm fine," and kept absorbing. Jung called this the inflation of the feeling function. When compassion grows so unchecked, it swallows the rest of the psyche. You become all heart, no spine, all light, no shadow. You stop existing as an individual and start existing as a mirror, reflecting the pain of others, but never your own truth. The empath becomes the healer who bleeds, the listener who is never heard, the giver who slowly vanishes behind everyone else's healing. And with each act of kindness, the psyche pays a price, a quiet depletion, a soul thinning. You think this is love, but love does not require you to disappear. You think this is strength, but strength without boundaries is collapse in slow motion. Jung warned that when empathy is disconnected from consciousness, it becomes possession. You are no longer feeling with others. You are being possessed by their feelings. Their suffering becomes your suffering. Their chaos becomes your home. And somewhere between compassion and exhaustion, you lose the sacred center called self. That loss is subtle but devastating. You start to confuse emotional pain with purpose. You wear your exhaustion like a badge of goodness. You tell yourself you were born this way, but beneath that spiritual narrative lies the truth. You've been conditioned to believe that disappearing is the highest form of love. The psyche cannot sustain that forever. Jung called it psychic compensation. Whatever is suppressed must one day rise to restore balance. And when it does, the empath begins to crack. You start feeling resentment toward the very people you once saved. You fantasize about running away, disappearing, or just being unseen for a while. You think you're broken, but in reality, your soul is demanding something sacred, boundaries. The moment you stop giving blindly, you will feel guilt because the world has taught you that saying no means you've stopped being kind. But that guilt is not a sign of cruelty. It's the birth pain of consciousness. You're not becoming heartless. you're becoming whole. This is the first and most painful truth every empath must face. If you keep trying to heal others while neglecting your own wounds, your empathy will eventually turn against you. It will start to consume you softly, quietly, until your compassion becomes a form of self-erasure. And that's where Jung's warning begins. Not about the people who drain you, but about the part of you that keeps saying yes while silently dying inside. Because the world doesn't destroy empaths, their unhealed empathy does. What if your empathy wasn't pure light? What if, hidden beneath every act of kindness, there was a shadow quietly shaping your need to help? Carl Jung believed that the unconscious always seeks balance. When one side of the psyche overdevelops, the other retreats into darkness, waiting for its turn to be seen. That means even your tenderness has a twin. Your empathy carries its own shadow. At first glance, that idea feels almost blasphemous. How could compassion, something sacred, have a dark side? But Jung would argue that this is exactly why most empaths suffer. They mistake their emotional sensitivity for virtue, when in truth, it's often a defense. Many empaths are not simply born this way. They're made this way, forged in households where love was unpredictable, where peace had to be maintained at all costs. Somewhere in childhood, they learned that to survive, they had to feel what others felt, anticipate moods, and regulate everyone's emotions except their own. That early vigilance becomes their gift and their prison, and so they grow up mistaking hyper-awareness for empathy, self-erasure for love. They become experts in reading energy, but illiterate in expressing their own truth. They can sense someone's sadness from across a room, but cannot recognize their own boundaries crumbling. Jung called this kind of imbalance a complex, an autonomous psychic structure that hijacks the ego from within. The empath's complex is built around the wounded healer archetype, the need to heal others as a way to avoid facing one's own pain. You don't just help people because they need you. You help because you can't bear the echo of your own suffering when they remind you of it. The shadow of empathy is self-avoidance dressed as compassion. Every time you rescue someone from their chaos, you're really rescuing the part of you that once felt powerless. Every time you say yes when your body screams no, you're reenacting the moment you learned that love must be earned. This isn't moral failure, it's emotional autopilot. But Jung's warning is clear. Whatever you refuse to make conscious will control you. Unexamined empathy becomes emotional possession. You start to merge with others' pain until you can't tell where they end and you begin. You call it connection, but it's actually collapse. When you live entirely in empathy, you lose polarity. You become all receiver, no generator. You absorb without transforming, love without discerning, feel without anchoring. The psyche, like the body, cannot survive constant permeability. And this is where the unconscious begins to rebel. The empath starts attracting people who mirror the very shadow they refuse to face. Narcissists, emotional manipulators, wounded souls who demand endless healing. It's not a curse, it's a reflection. The psyche is saying, see what your kindness has become. You meet your shadow not in meditation or miracles, but in the people who test your boundaries. Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. So when you find yourself trapped in one-sided relationships, it's not punishment, it's revelation. The universe is showing you the part of your empathy that has turned into servitude. True compassion is born when the empath dares to look at their shadow and ask, "Who am I when I'm not needed?" For many, that question feels unbearable, because if you stop being the helper, who are you? If you no longer fix others, what purpose remains? That emptiness is the beginning of real empathy. Empathy rooted in consciousness, not in compulsion. To reach that point, you must endure what Jung called the descent into the shadow. It's not poetic, it's terrifying. You begin to feel anger toward those who once drained you, and even deeper, anger toward yourself for allowing it. You grieve the years you gave away. You face the truth that your kindness wasn't always clean. It was laced with fear, guilt, and the desperate hunger to belong. But paradoxically, this confrontation is what purifies empathy. Because to love without illusion, you must first see the illusions that shaped your love. And when you finally let that realization sink in, something strange happens. The empathy that once exhausted you begins to change texture. It becomes quieter, sharper, rooted. You no longer rush to soothe pain. The moment you feel it, you pause. You listen not just to them, but to yourself. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the raw, chaotic compassion of the ego. The base metal must undergo fire to become the gold of consciousness. That fire is the shadow. It burns away the savior complex, the martyr identity, the endless guilt that once defined you. After the fire, only true empathy remains, the kind that feels deeply but doesn't drown, that helps but doesn't absorb, that loves without losing itself. This is what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So the warning every empath must hear is not to stop caring, but to stop confusing care with control, love with rescue, light with denial. Your sensitivity is not your weakness. Your exhaustion is not a badge of honor. It's a message from the psyche saying, you've gone too far from yourself. And if you listen carefully, beneath the noise of other people's pain, you'll hear your own voice whispering, you don't have to earn love by carrying suffering anymore. That's the first act of real healing, turning your empathy inward, not to close off, but to balance, not to withdraw, but to remember that feeling. Everything is not the same as being everything, because the shadow behind your kindness was never evil. It was just unloved. And when you finally embrace it, your empathy transforms from a wound into wisdom. There comes a moment in every empath's life when silence becomes unbearable, not because of others, but because the soul begins to whisper truths that the old self can no longer ignore. It starts quietly, as most awakenings do. A flicker of clarity cuts through the fog of endless giving. You suddenly feel the weight of every unspoken no, every time you absorbed pain to keep the peace. And in that split second, something ancient within you stirs, not weakness, not guilt, but power. This is the forbidden threshold. The moment when an empath stops trying to be light for others and starts becoming fire for themselves. Carl Jung called this stage the confrontation with the shadow, the phase of individuation, where one meets the repressed forces of the psyche and learns to live with them, not against them. For the empaths, it means meeting the parts of themselves they've been taught to exile: anger, desire, boundaries, self-interest, even indifference. You were told these traits make you cold, selfish, unloving, but Jung would disagree. He knew that repressing power does not make you holy, It makes you haunted. The shadow you refuse becomes the master you serve. And so, the awakened empath begins the hardest work of all, reclaiming the energy they gave away. At first, it feels wrong. Setting a boundary feels like betrayal. Saying no feels like violence. Letting others face their own pain feels cruel. But beneath that discomfort lies liberation. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And for the empath, this pain is sacred. It's the burning away of illusion. You start realizing that what you called empathy was often self-abandonment, wearing the mask of love. That your constant rescuing was not compassion, but control. That by absorbing everyone's emotions, you weren't helping them. You were protecting yourself from the fear of being powerless. Now, the mirror turns. You begin to feel your own emotions, raw and unfiltered. Without rushing to fix them, rage rises, not the destructive kind, but the primal voice of the self saying, "Enough." For the first time, you listen. You let the anger speak its truth. It tells you where your energy was stolen, where your identity was diluted, where your light was used as currency, and instead of suppressing it, you integrate it. Because Jung understood something profound. The goal is not to transcend the shadow, but to become whole through it. Light that denies darkness is fragile. Light that embraces it becomes indestructible. The conscious empath is born here in the merging of tenderness and strength, sensitivity and sovereignty. You no longer absorb emotions unconsciously. You witness them. You feel, but you do not fuse. You can stand in the storm of another's pain without drowning in it. This is not detachment. It's mastery. You have learned the sacred art of discernment, knowing what is yours to carry and what is not. In Jungian terms, this is the emergence of the self, the central archetype of wholeness. It's the point where the fragmented pieces of your psyche begin to align. The inner child who feared rejection, the rescuer who lived through others, the shadow that demanded truth. They all sit at the same table now. They no longer fight for control. They collaborate. And with that integration comes a new kind of presence. Quiet, commanding, magnetic. People feel it even when you say nothing, because when you are no longer possessed by the need to please, your energy becomes sovereign. The irony is that the world now responds to you differently. The same people who once took from you without gratitude now sense an invisible boundary they dare not cross. The ones who sought to control you grow uneasy because they no longer recognize the old version of you, the version that existed only to reflect their emotions. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. When you stop carrying others' unconscious material, you force them to confront their own. Some will resist, some will rage, but that is not your concern. You have finally stepped out of the collective dream and into individual consciousness. This is the empath's awakening, not a soft, poetic enlightenment, but a fierce reclamation of self. It's the realization that true love doesn't dissolve you, it defines you. That real compassion flows from choice, not compulsion. That saying no can be the most spiritual act of all. In the stillness that follows, you'll notice something extraordinary. Your energy begins to regenerate. The fatigue that once haunted you lifts. Your mind feels clearer, your emotions steadier, your body lighter. You start creating instead of merely containing. You speak less, but your words carry more weight. You love less often, but far more deeply. This is the hidden gift of the shadow clarity. When you stop trying to save the world, you finally see it as it is. And in that seeing, compassion becomes wisdom. But Jung would warn, awakening is not the end. The conscious empath must now learn to live among the asleep without losing their clarity. The challenge is not to rise above the world, but to move through it without absorption, to love without losing shape, to feel without surrendering the self. That is the forbidden power, empathy anchored in consciousness. It cannot be manipulated because it no longer seeks validation. It cannot be drained because it draws from the infinite well of self-awareness. And once you taste this kind of power, there's no going back. You realize that your sensitivity was never a curse. It was your initiation, that your pain was never punishment. It was the training ground for your evolution. The world taught you that strength means hardness. Jung would say, strength is integration, the courage to hold both the light and the shadow, love and truth, empathy and boundary in the same heart. That is the moment the empath stops surviving and starts creating. Carl Jung called it the necessary withdrawal, a period when the psyche retreats not out of fear, but out of wisdom. After illumination comes integration, and integration demands stillness. For the empath, this moment arrives like a quiet evening after a violent storm. The noise of the world still hums in the distance, but you no longer feel compelled to answer it. You begin to crave solitude, not as escape, but as oxygen. The very spaces that once made you feel isolated now feel sacred. Silence, once unbearable, becomes your teacher. This is the sacred withdrawal, the rebirth of energy through distance. At first, it feels strange. The old self still whispers, "You're being cold, you're abandoning people, you've changed." But the conscious part of you knows better. You haven't changed. You've returned. You're finally living from the center of your being, not the periphery of other people's needs. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires separation from the collective. He compared it to the alchemist withdrawing to his laboratory, where transformation occurs in solitude. In that container, base metals become gold. In the empath's case, exhaustion becomes clarity, and sensitivity becomes strength. So you step back, you stop explaining, you stop overgiving, you stop offering yourself as the emotional bridge for every broken soul who cannot carry their own weight. Instead, you learn the quiet art of presence without performance. This withdrawal is not rejection, it's refinement. The empath who once scattered their energy across the world now channels it like light through a prism, focused, precise, unshakable. In this stillness, you rediscover your own frequency. You begin to notice the subtle beauty of your own energy field when it's not being distorted by others. The mind quiets, the body breathes differently. Even your emotions start to feel like music instead of noise. You realize something extraordinary. Peace was never outside you. It was merely drowned beneath the chorus of everyone else's chaos. Jung often warned that modern people suffer from a loss of soul, a disconnection from the inner world. For the empaths, that loss comes disguised as compassion. But now, in this sacred solitude, the soul begins to return. It does not enter with fireworks. It arrives softly, like dawn through fog. Familiar, forgiving, whole. You start to remember the parts of yourself you had forgotten. The artist, the child, the dreamer, the one who simply is. You understand now that empathy without self-awareness is noise, but empathy rooted in consciousness becomes language. one that speaks through stillness rather than struggle. The world may not understand this phase. People will call you detached, unavailable, maybe even arrogant. But you know what Jung meant when he said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing, which makes my life worth living." You are not disappearing. You are distilling. And from this quiet center, something miraculous happens. You begin to feel connected again, but not in the old way. You're no longer tethered by need or obligation. You are linked through awareness, through choice, through love that has learned to include the self. This is what Jung called living symbolically, when your life itself becomes a bridge between inner and outer worlds. Every boundary you set becomes an act of creation. Every silence becomes a form of prayer. Every no becomes a doorway to a deeper yes. You stop chasing alignment because you've become alignment. You stop seeking healing because you've realized that healing is not a destination. It's a rhythm, a way of moving through life consciously. And in that awareness, empathy becomes sacred again. Not the frantic, draining empathy of survival, but the luminous empathy of understanding. You no longer try to fix others. You illuminate what they already carry. You no longer carry their pain. You reflect their potential. You don't absorb their darkness. You remind them of their light. This is the true rebirth of the empath, when your compassion ceases to be reactive and becomes radiant. From this space of stillness, the world feels different. You see the collective unconscious for what it is: a sea of projections, fears, and unintegrated shadows. But instead of fighting it, you observe it with gentle detachment. You realize that your task is not to save the world, but to stay awake within it. And as Jung said, a tree that reaches to heaven must have roots that reach down to hell. You have traveled those roots. You have touched your darkness, not to drown in it, but to find the light that was never dependent on anyone's approval. Now, your energy no longer leaks. It circulates. Your empathy no longer exhausts it. Empowers. Your silence no longer isolates, it sanctifies. You are no longer the wounded healer trying to mend everyone's fractures. You are the integrated soul, radiating wholeness simply by existing. And that, Jung would say, is the final transformation, the return to the world, not as a savior, but as a symbol. You may still feel the pull of others' pain, but it no longer defines you. You may still love deeply, but that love no longer demands self-erasure. You may still walk among the unconscious, but you do so with open eyes, aware that you are not here to join their sleep. You are here to hold the lamp. So when the world grows loud again, remember this: withdrawal is not disappearance. It is preparation. Stillness is not weakness. It is mastery. And empathy, true empathy, is not about carrying the world. It is about becoming the still point around which the world begins to heal itself. You have not lost your softness. You have found your spine. You have not turned cold. You have become clear. And that clarity, that sacred balance of love and power, that is the final warning every empath must hear. If you do not protect your light, the world will use it until it goes out. But if you learn to guard it, to nurture it, to let it burn steadily rather than endlessly, then your light will not only survive, it will illuminate. If these words found you at the right moment, if something in you recognizes this journey, it means your awakening has already begun. Don't rush it. Don't fight it. Just stay conscious. And if you want to walk this path deeper, If you want to understand what Jung truly meant by individuation, shadow integration, and the rebirth of the self, you're not alone. There's a community here built for those who feel too much, think too deeply, and refuse to go back to sleep. Like this video. If it spoke to your soul, share it with someone who's still carrying the weight that was never theirs. And subscribe, not for content, but for clarity. Each week, we explore Jung's timeless insights and the hidden psychology of awakening. Until then, stay conscious and protect your light.